stability and trust is what exactly makes all of these things ties together. And stability and trust is coming from the infrastructure, and one of them is a legal infrastructure. So I know that it's not fair to put Africa as a one plateau. Okay, there are different countries and the different mechanism of the legal structure. But if we want to go high up from the helicopter point of view as well, just to start to draw these particular points, whether that particular stability, whether particular growth is also infected in the legal infrastructure from the laws and regulations and the policing system of that particular laws and regulations.
Good morning, everyone, and can you hear me? Yeah? And thank you for inviting me. Thank you to Mahmoud in particular. I haven't seen him, but for inviting me to join this conversation. Before addressing your question directly, if you allow me, Hafid, I would like to come back on your first question and in a way from the perspective of a dispute resolution practitioner, but more from the perspective of an institution like ICC, and I'm not trading commodities like you are, Mr. Celine, and I'm not an economist, but what we observe is that, at least to date, if we look at the picture today, the strength of African economies that drives also, that feeds the dispute resolution activity coming out of Africa relies mostly in natural resources, in construction work, unsurprisingly. You find the same in other jurisdictions. But also in areas that you don't necessarily expect, and there I join you with commodities. Agribusiness is one of the areas that does trigger a number of disputes on the African continent, and other human activities such as telecommunications. So what's interesting from that perspective is really to see where today the disputes are arising, but remember that those disputes are the mirror of deals that were made in the past, let's say, 5 years, with some exceptions. Sometimes you do have disputes arising from deals that are much older. But it's interesting to look at that, and when I hear you, and knowing a bit the African continent, I have no doubt that the landscape will continue changing, and that slowly we will move away from those disputes and those deals coming out of natural resources trading, energy, infrastructure, and move towards general business disputes that we see in more, I would say, developed economies, slowly but surely. And one thing that in my own observation is a testament to that is actually the evolution we've seen at ICC of the industry sectors in the disputes here in the Middle East. When I joined ICC 15 years ago, a bit less than 15 years ago, the volume and the type of disputes coming out of this region were rather quite different from those we are dealing with today. So quite by way of comparison, you can expect a similar trajectory, although, of course, the degree of development is not the same in Africa. One other comment I wanted to make when we were preparing this conversation was, talking about what drives the economy and the economic development of African countries. And here I'm not talking from a technical or an expert point of view, but from my own observation, what I can say is that the biggest, I think, resource or chance of Africa is the demographics, in quantity and in quality. We do have, and often observers from outside, observers relying on macroeconomics are ignoring that fact. Often they miss that point, which is that when I was younger, growing up in France, the vision that was portrayed of Africa in the media was a very poor continent with, very uneducated populations, no middle class at all. All this is not the reality today, although it's not necessarily reflected in the vision that you might have if you're not a specialist of Africa from the general media. Not only is it not true today, but the demographic of Africa have changed to a point that today African rulers understand that their first accountability is not to the capital that is coming into their countries, but to their population. Sometimes in contradiction with what that capital might want them to do. And that's important to bear in mind, because again, that's where the strength and the drivers of the change of the economies in Africa, in my view, is and will be in the future. Now, coming to the legal infrastructure. Again, talking about Africa as a whole can only be a mistake. And when you talk about legal infrastructure, even more so, because there are as many legal framework as there are African lawmakers, basically. From the north to the east to the south, you will have very different approaches to the same issues, including to international arbitration, international dispute resolution. What we can observe in that regard in the recent past is that there has been a movement to harmonize, or let's say to get closer to the global or international accepted standards in terms of protecting investment and in terms of ensuring neutral and safe platforms for the resolution of disputes, cross-border disputes. So most countries have to date regulations in terms of dispute resolution protection, dispute resolution and investment protection. But even when I was talking about the changes of the African lawmakers in different countries, which are driven by the need of African population first and foremost, even within those jurisdictions, what you observe is that the investment protections are being revisited precisely through the prisma of the need of African businesses, African economies, rather than the needs of external investors that would be the first and the only driver. And one interesting example, a couple of months ago, I was in Senegal, where maybe some of you know, there has been a recent change of political party in ruling after a very interesting election and fascinating legal discussions in the country. And this new regime in place has clearly a very strong and very different view of the economies, not just for their own country, but generally for the region. And they intend to actually apply that. And one of the things, talking with the head of the equivalent of the Solicitor General, one of the things that came out from that conversation was that he was explaining that he's been charged by the Prime Minister to revise, to review, audit, and potentially revise the existing investment treaties that the country has. Currently, Senegal has 29 in force, and go through that exercise to understand whether or not they are beneficial to Senegal. And if not, then the mandate is actually to sit at the table with the counterparts and renegotiate them. And if there's no room for a renegotiation, then indeed terminate them. That, again, exercise might not be well received from where the capital historically comes from into some African jurisdiction. But there has to be, really, I think it's important for a lot of people to upgrade their own software, to realize that Africans have changed and that they're not driven by the same interests that they used to. And that's a good thing for African population. And now, for our own practice, as dispute resolution practitioners, I think it's important to understand that the same thing goes for our practice, meaning that one should not expect to be resolving disputes in relation to African businesses without involving African practitioners, without involving African lawyers, arbitrators, experts, and so on. And so in that discussions we're having today about, the suitability of the IFCA DGM for resolving African disputes, I think one important point to keep in the focus is that that should be done while always associating African experts and practitioners in the process.